What's up, beautiful people? Today we are covering the 7 Years' War, in North America known as the French and Indian War. Let's get into the background. In the mid-18th century, colonial rivalry intensified between Britain in the yellow and France in the red purplish color. What are they beefing over? The population of the British colonies expanded into the interior of North America and came into contact with areas claimed by France. Remember, although this area is claimed by France, the population of New France was substantially smaller than the British 13 colonies. Since the French had way less people in North America and tended to coexist with Native American tribes, there was the fur trade, some intermarriage. The British colonists' entry into the interior of North America threatened not only French claims to this region, but also threatened French Indian trade networks and American Indian autonomy. The French and Indian War would not be the first war between these European powers. 3 other wars would also take place. All of these wars demonstrate that European imperial powers fought one another for dominance in North America. Ultimately, the French and Indian War would break out when a Virginian named George Washington was sent with the Virginia militia to warn the French to stay the heck away from British land claims. Shots were fired and we got ourselves a war that was started in North America. The French and Indian War would start in North America over this conflict in the Ohio Valley, a competition between Britain and France over colonial territory in North America. In 1756, the war would become a global conflict called the 7 Years' War. Cheers to one of the first world wars. In terms of who is fighting, on one side you have the French and a lot of important alliances with various Indian groups. It makes sense the majority of Native American tribes in the region would side with the French. There are far fewer of them. They had established trade networks with the French settlements, and Britain was seen as the far greater threat. On the other side were the British, who also had some alliances with local tribes, but nowhere near what France had, and of course, her 13 colonies. Early on, the colonists and their mama country, Britain, struggled against the French and their Native American allies. The immediate challenge was to figure out how the colonies and mama would defend the colonies against the French. To accomplish this goal, a meeting was held called the ALBANY Congress in 1754. At the Albany Congress, the founding father, Benjamin Franklin, proposed his Albany Plan of Union. This is the context for Mr. Benny Franklin creating the political cartoon Join or Die. The basic premise of the plan was for the colonies to cooperate by choosing representatives that would meet to coordinate colonial defense and Western expansion. Or to put simply, join or die. They also invited members of the Iroquois Confederacy to try to convince them to join Team Mama England against the French and their Indian allies. Nothing, unfortunately, really came of the Albany Plan. Remember, these colonies have no real shared history with one another. They don't see themselves as having a common goal. However, the Albany Plan would establish a precedent for the colonies coordinating with one another that would actually come into existence with the Stamp Act Congress, Continental Congress, and other events we will talk about in the near future. While at first the French were winning the French and Indian War, unfortunately for them, that didn't last too long. Eventually, the war would end in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. France was kicked out of North America. They lost all their colonial territory, but not in North America, and a place they will keep in the Western Hemisphere is Haiti, which will be important when we get to the Louisiana Purchase. Foreshadowing. With the defeat of the French, Britain got a ton of new territory. All that land they were originally beefing over in the Ohio River Valley was granted to Britain. Also granted was Canada, and they also got Florida from Spain. French lands west of the Mississippi were handed over to Spain. Now that the land in the Ohio River Valley was free of French control, colonists sought to expand westward into this territory. They figured the Ohio River Valley is open for settlement. There are some challenges for Britain, though. England has to maintain control over this large chunk of territory they just won. They suddenly have to deal with the French colonists who are in Canada that they just acquired, and they also have to deal with conflicts between the colonists and American Indians in the frontier. France's loss in the French and Indian War was not only bad for France, but also for various American Indian tribes. They not only lost their main trading partner, but their claims to the land were not at all recognized by the Treaty of Paris. Problems are going to emerge really quickly. Pontiac, an Ottawa chief, forged a Western Confederation and rebelled against colonists encroaching on Native American land in 1763. Pontiac's rebellion ultimately led to the death of a bunch of colonists, and of course the colonists are looking at Mama, help me! In response, Britain not only had to keep additional troops in North America, not only to crush Pontiac's rebellion, but also to govern their vast new territorial holdings acquired from the French and Indian War. To help accomplish this goal, Parliament passed the Proclamation Line of 1763. This act forbid colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Mountains. The hope was this would prevent conflict between colonists and American Indians on the frontier, and it makes sense. If colonists can't go west of the Appalachian Mountains into Native American land, the likelihood of them being killed by American Indians dramatically goes down, and Britain won't be asked to defend the colonists. But the Proclamation Act of 1763 was one part of growing colonial resentment towards Britain. Another impact of the French and Indian War was a tremendous increase in Britain's debt. Not only was the war pricey, but look at all that territory Britain has to protect and govern. War is expensive, and the British saw the war as part of the defense of the colonies. Therefore, in the minds of Britain, the colonies should help pay down the debt and the added cost of administering a much bigger empire in North America. This is where the taxes are going to come in. But remember, for most of the time period, the colonies were allowed a great degree of freedom. This was called solitary neglect. After 1763, this period of solitary neglect will come to an end, as in response to the new realities, Britain will seek to raise revenue through taxes and consolidate control over the colonies. New taxes and increased regulation was another part of growing colonial resentment towards Britain. Colonists see things very differently. They felt they fought in the French and Indian War and should be able to reap the rewards of that war. In their minds, the land is ours. So in the end, the French and Indian War had enormous consequences for the relationship between Mama Britain and her 13 kiddos. The biggest effect of the French and Indian War, though, will be a dramatic change in British colonial policy. And in our next video, I will examine taxation without representation. Until next time, thank you so much for watching this Jocz Productions video. Have a beautiful day. Peace.